Welcome everyone, I'm the Body Counter, and this is part 2 of the Poland Faces of War episode. Last time I covered the Polish-Soviet War prior to World War II, and Poland's downfall against the German-Soviet invasion of the nation. For today, I'll be sharing with you the grim history behind the German-Soviet occupation of the country, the government and military in exile, and the brave endurance of the Polish population that still remained in their torn lands. Following the Polish defeat during Operation Weiss, the Polish government, remnants of the armed forces and other citizens would flee the country just in time, where they would travel to France in 1940 to re-establish themselves as the Polish government in exile. General Władysław Sikorski would be the first Prime Minister of this government, and the Commander-in-Chief of the Polish Armed Forces for the majority of Poland's participation in the Allied war effort. The new Polish army were to be retrained in the use of French firearms, planes and tanks for the new role they had amongst their Western allies. They formed 2 brigades, one rifle and one armoured, and was placed under French control, which was to be a fatal mistake in the long run. However, an event that went unnoticed for the Polish forces, which would ultimately impact them heavily, would be the Katyn massacre. In April 1940, 20,000 Polish officers in Soviet-occupied Poland were massed in and around the Katyn forest and executed by the Soviet secret police, an event which would later spark a serious debate. By spring of 1940, the Polish armed forces in the west stood at 80,000 strong, and their first real action alongside the other Allied forces would be during the Battle of Narvik, where around 5,000 Poles fought alongside their British, French and Norwegian allies from the 9th of April till early June. The Allies would fight hard and manage to push the German forces out of key areas in Narvik, but the Allies had no real long-term objective for holding the city, or the rest of Norway, and so the Allies withdrew all their troops by the 8th of June. Halfway through the Battle of Narvik, back in Western Europe, the Battle of France would commence, or more unfavourably named, the Fall of France. Due to the poor French leadership, logistics and organisation, most of the Poles would suffer the same fate as the French in many instances during the invasion, with only 18,000 to 20,000 soldiers managing to escape safely to Britain. Polish pilots would be fighting the Luftwaffe for the second time, and would grow to become a notorious threat to the Germans. However, their enthusiasm and experience would not be enough to stop their air superiority from falling into the Luftwaffe's grasp. Around 5,000 to 5,500 Polish soldiers would be killed or wounded during the Battle of France. Around 15,000 would be captured, and another 12,000 would be forced into Switzerland, rather than surrendering to the Germans. These soldiers would not be able to leave the neutral country until the war's end. After the fall of France, the Polish government in exile, along with the remnants of the armed forces, managed to escape to Britain, where they were re-equipped and retrained for the second time in Scotland. Those members of the Polish Air Force which had survived the invasion of Poland and France were to join the Royal Air Force as volunteers. The Poles had 2 fighter and bomber squadrons to begin with, and almost every British air squadron had a Polish volunteer amongst them. The Polish air volunteers would face their trial by fire during the Battle of Britain, a battle which was solely fought in the skies above the island. It was also stated that the censorship in British media seemed to deliberately overlook the Polish participation in the air. Furious, the Royal Air Force demanded the Poles get the credit they deserved for doing significantly better than most pilots of the Royal Air Force. Many in the RAF were doubtful on the Polish volunteers' capabilities and efficiency in combat, but were proven wrong very quickly when they took to the skies. Some sources saying that when a Polish pilot was forced to parachute back onto British soil, they would return back to base with a British girl in each arm. Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding wrote, "Had it not been for the magnificent material contributed by the Polish squadrons and their unsurpassed gallantry, I hesitate to say that the outcome of the battle would have been the same." From the onset of the invasion of Poland, the Nazi death squads were tasked with the eradication of Polish civilians, political officials, Jews, and many other in the occupied territories. And once the entire country had surrendered, they could begin the complete cleansing of Poland for Germany's future Lebensraum. The Nazis set up concentration camps, extermination camps, and ghettos throughout Europe, with a large handful of them being set up in Poland. Camps such as Auschwitz, Treblinka, Bujec, and Szelmino would claim the most lives. 3 million Jewish Poles were killed during the Holocaust, which was half of the entire 6 million Jews that were murdered. Concentration camps were Germany's source of forced labour. Here, millions would enter the camp in boxcars and were worked to death with little to no food. Disease, malnutrition, and executions claimed the lives of too many to count. Extermination camps, on the other hand, had no labour value and were designed for the sole purpose of eradicating undesirables. Jews, gypsies, the mentally ill, homosexuals, and other ethnicities. But the German occupation of Poland only fueled rebellion, and as early as September 1939, a resistance group was already born, the Polish Underground State. At the beginning, the politics behind the underground government were very fragile and many issues arose, But in the next few years, the underground state would become the largest resistance movement in all of Europe, having their own schools, courts, and many other social services like hospitals. In 1942, the Polish resistance would create the Home Army, totaling at 400,000 to 600,000 soldiers at its peak. From 1942 to the end of the war, the Home Army would undertake in over 100,000 attacks intended to cripple the German occupiers and distract them from more important matters. Polish soldiers and agents within Nazi territory would commit acts of sabotage, execute high-profile members of the German Reich, spike fuel tanks needed for vehicles, and many other annoyances. With the Polish underground state came the Żegota. Formed from the ashes of the Provisional Committee to Aid Jews, Żegota aimed to support the Jewish population in any way they could, whether it was creating new identities for them, or giving them food, water, and shelter. Aiding a Jew was punishable by death, so every member of Żegota knew what awaited them, but was still determined to aid the scarred people. But in 1941, a line was being crossed, which would in turn help the Polish in their quest to liberate their homeland. On the 22nd of June, 1941, Germany declared war on the Soviet Union, commencing Operation Barbarossa with blitzing speed. This move, however, was a golden opportunity for the Polish government in exile. With Britain prodding Stalin to reconcile their relations with Poland, an agreement was formed between the Polish government and the USSR. Stalin would allow the release of Polish POWs and civilians from imprisonment, where the Polish government would be able to form Anders' army, a 75,000-strong force in the east. The event of the Katyn massacre would severely impact the leadership amongst the newly formed army, but the Polish troops and the rest of the forces in the west still had no idea of this horrible atrocity. Sikorski wished for Anders' army to fight alongside the Red Army on the eastern front, but Anders himself thought it would be more viable for his army to be sent to the Allies in the Middle East. An agreement was finally made, and a portion of Anders' army would be sent to Iraq to fight under British command, and the rest would form the First Polish Army, which would fight under the Soviet flag. With this agreement in place, Anders' army was sailed across the Caspian Sea, through Iran and into Iraq, along with several thousand Polish civilians, equaling a total of 115,000 soldiers and civilian arrivals in the Middle East. The troops now in the Middle East were desperate to see combat, wanting to take the fight to the Germans. During the North African campaign, Polish forces would relieve the courageous Australian defenders at Tobruk alongside a Czech battalion as well. After the victory at Tobruk and the Allies successfully defeating Rommel in Africa, a tragic discovery was realised. During the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the bodies of the 20,000 Polish officers of the Katyn massacre were uncovered by the Germans. The Allies soon heard of this secret. All fingers were being pointed to the Russians who denied the event, and the Soviet-Polish relations were again cut. Following the debate, a horrible accident struck the Poles. General Sikorski boarded a plane in Gibraltar to the UK, when mysteriously, the plane suddenly crashed into the sea seconds after takeoff, killing everybody on board except the pilot. This tragedy struck the spirit and morale of the Polish armed forces and those back home, and this only further increased hostilities between Poland and the USSR, seeing how the death of Sikorski was coincidentally around the time the Russians severed their relations with the Polish government. But despite their brave leader's death, a new leader was appointed, and the Poles were gearing up for their next big battle. From July to September of 1943, a joint Anglo-American invasion of Sicily and mainland Italy began and struck with success. A Polish corps of Anders' army joined the British army in the invasion of Italy, and their major contribution would be at the Battle of Monte Cassino. The German and Italian Gustav Line, a series of fortifications in the way of Rome, held the Allied advance, and taking Cassino would fracture this defence. Allies struck the area several times and the Axis forces repulsed many of the attacks. But upon the fourth push, the Polish corps slowly worked their way from the town to the monastery which overlooked Cassino, and with the Free French diversions in the south, a majority of the German defenders were forced to withdraw, with only German paratroops remaining to defend the strategic point. A day later, the Polish flag was raised over the ruins of Monte Cassino. As the Polish forces along with their other brothers-in-arms fought upwards through Italy, the Polish army in Britain was gearing up for their fight against the Reich, the Allied invasion of France. The Polish armed forces didn't participate in the D-Day landings themselves, but instead fought from the sea and air, bombing German positions and raining air supremacy in the skies. It was later, after the initial landings, did the Poles see combat in France, more specifically, the Polish Armoured Division. Alongside a Canadian fighting force, the Polish Armoured Division was tasked with closing a pocket in Falaise. Leading the advance, the Poles and British and American tanks completed the encirclement, killing some 10,000 German soldiers and capturing 50,000, many of them being the highly fanatical SS divisions. Still awaiting to participate in the conflict was the Polish Parachute Brigade. The British had a plan for their deployment, but much of the brigade wanted to persuade their allies to send them to Poland, for the great struggle that had just begun. By 1944, the USSR was pushing the Germans back into Poland, the moment that the Polish underground state had been waiting for. On the 1st of August, the Polish resistance and many thousand civilians sparked the Warsaw Uprising, the single greatest European uprising of the war. The uprising was to begin around the time the Soviets would reach Warsaw, in order for Russian support to aid the Poles in clearing the Germans out of the city. However, this did not go to plan. Stalin ordered that the army stop outside of Warsaw and wait for the resistance to be crushed before mopping up the German defenders. Stalin had plans for Poland, and the resistance was pro-democracy, something that the dictator did not want around when Europe was liberated. Without any Soviet support or aid from the Allies, the Polish resistance fought in vicious house-to-house and street combat in the decimated capital. Resistance fighters wore Polish flag-coloured cloth around their captured German helmets or around their shoulders to tell each other apart, and fought desperately against their exhausted oppressors. The first few days were successful for the most part, catching the Germans by surprise, and it wouldn't be until the later stages of the 63-day-long rebellion that the resistance would begin to rely on defending what they had captured, such as German munition stations or even buildings that still stood. Despite this, many German commanders compared the combat to that of Stalingrad. Unfortunately, the uprising was eventually halted and the resistance was forced back into hiding. One of the greatest rebellion efforts of the war, snuffed out by Soviet plans for European expansion. Back on the reopened Western Front, the Polish Parachute Brigade were to be deployed during Operation Market Garden, the Allies' attempt to siege bridges on the Rhine River. The Polish paratroops, however, were sent in 4 days after the main Allied force landed, due to bad weather, and the Poles were unable to relieve the British forces at Arnhem successfully. Almost all of the Polish and British paratroops were killed or captured by the Germans, with only a fraction of them making it back across the Rhine to the Allied-controlled territory. After their disaster during Operation Market Garden, they did continue with the Allies through Germany, making it as far as Wilhelmshaven on the German coast, with their homelands still out of reach. After the war's end, Poland was not celebrating. They were betrayed. Poland was not liberated. It just changed dictators. Hitler was exchanged with Stalin, fascism with communism, a people still enslaved. The Yalta Conference set the lands of Poland in the Soviet sphere of influence, along with Czechoslovakia and East Germany. Poland was granted extra land from Germany, however, increasing their Baltic coast 7-fold. The soldiers of the armed forces were faced with either returning back to Poland or staying in their new homelands which they had fought with. Many remained in Britain, France and other Western European countries. The interned Polish forces in Switzerland, which fought in the Battle of France, could finally leave after 6 years of not being able to fight with their brothers. An approximate 6 million Polish civilians were killed during the war, and an estimated 160,000 military personnel lost their lives. The nation was a long way to rebuilding what had been lost during the war, but its people remained hopeful that in time they would finally be free once again. Throughout the Cold War period, several protests and worker strikes hit the nation, and it wouldn't be until 1989 that Poland would become a democratic nation once more, and the Polish government in exile finally dissolved in December 1990. I hope you enjoyed this last part of Poland's Face of War. It was certainly lengthier than Japan, but still equally as interesting and full of rich history. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to drop a like to show your support, join my Discord to partake in the memes and discussion, subscribe to keep up to date for when I upload next, and as always, keep on fighting. Yeah, I don't know either, but continue gaming on sounds kinda cringy as of late.
Woo! Let's game on!